All right, well, thanks for joining us today, whether you're live or viewing this as a recording. This is the third in a series of at least 5 Friday webinars that we're putting on, and then we're also sharing via the Facebook group for the project as well. So for those of you that are watching recorded, feel free to, if you want, actually to post comments to the Facebook group and we can get them that way, or you're welcome to either email the presenter or Carrie or myself or any of the other presenters, and we can also address some questions that way. So today's speaker is going to be Tommy Bass, who is in our MSU's Department of Animal and Range Science. And among some other topics, one of the topics that Tommy spends some time researching and learning about is local meat processing in Montana and some of the local meat markets that might be available to Montana producers as a way to either diversify or expand their business, or at least evaluate and see whether it fits as part of their business model. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tommy, and feel free to send any questions in via the chat or ask questions at the end as well.
All right, hello everybody. I'm pleased to be here today and to give you an overview of local meat marketing and processing in Montana. And it is just that, an overview, so we just have a few minutes today. This is a complex system, but we hope to today break down some of the, potential perceived barriers about beginning to market animals and meat directly into a local food system. There's certainly been growing interest in local meats over the last decade or so. An association of restaurants and chefs has noted that it's the fastest growing segment of products at restaurants that consumers are asking for. There's similar data from grocery stores, both national chains and local grocery stores, that consumers are interested in local meat. But there are a lot of other drivers as well. It can provide market diversification for producers. So while some producers may continue to sell calves into the conventional system, there may be an opportunity to hold back a few animals, finish them out for local production of meat. And there are also other practical consumer needs and drivers. This spring and into the summer, we saw pretty severe supply chain disruption as a result of COVID-19 pandemic. That came a couple different ways. For one, the labor force working in the major meat processing plants around the country were impacted by the disease, and there were rolling shutdowns across all commodities of meat at the processing level as employees became ill. A lot of consumers too became less trustful of that conventional system just because of those disruptions. And so they turned to local needs. They were looking for local meat and these local supply chains. Particularly on a lot of our, or in our Native American communities across the nation, there are strong movements for food sovereignty and better control of one's own food security. This also is an important driver for local meat production. And then some research that Joel and I have done over the last few years. It was based in beef to school context, but we saw that community members, consumers, parents, local producers, a lot of folks were really interested in a local and short supply chain. It was something that they could visualize. They saw cattle on the landscape around their homes, and they felt pride in converting those local cattle into locally produced meat, in that case for schools, but also just for the local markets. Like I said, I'll reiterate, a lot of support and interest in helping those local producers and individuals and making food production, in this case meat, more of a community effort. And then there are opportunities for marketing some type of meat with a specialty production claim. That could be grass-fed. It could be simply just local, guaranteed, local short supply chain. It may be a specialty or a unique population that was involved in producing the product. So we've seen meat products branded, veteran produced, veteran owned meat company, Native American branded in different ways. And I just have a couple examples here in the images. The Montana Made program, while I'm unsure if there's a specific meat option, they do have a brand label for Native American made in Montana. And that could be part of your brand identity for a local meat product. There are a variety of market levels here, and what we're talking about is a short local supply chain. So local beef, cattle you see on the landscape being converted to meat in or near your own community, to be sold and served within your local region. It's important for family and community provisioning, so maybe a little bit less of open retail market scenario. But once again, this is really important for food sovereignty, food security, and independence. We'll get to some more examples, but what this might just mean is, a producer working with families or community entity to raise some cattle specifically to provide, eventually be processed and provide meat for a family or some community groups. And then there's the level of commercial markets and that supply chain. So that would be local cattle processed locally, regionally into meat to be sold at grocery stores locally. Many independent processors will have their own meat counter, their own brand. Same with butcher shops and further processors. And then there's opportunities for producers with direct sales. And this would be a scenario of where producer has cattle processed. They take back the inspected, packaged, processed meat, and then they direct market. Could be internet sales, it could be farm stands or going to farmers markets, or even having sort of like a buyer's club with ongoing customers. And then finally, restaurants and institutions. When we say institutions, we mean schools, nursing homes, community centers, daycares, any sort of community entity that might be serving some group meals or providing a lunch program. So really these market levels go from the very personal, direct sort of family provisioning through a variety of commercial market channels, and then also recognizing that other consumers could be the residents or attendees of schools, nursing homes, community centers, and daycares.
And Tommy, before you jump on, we had a question come in. Do you want to talk a little bit about storing some of that beef from when it's processed until it reaches that market? Or are producers bringing that meat back home and storing it in their chest freezer in the garage, or does it need to be commercially stored? Or it's kind of elaborate a little bit on that.
Sure thing. And this will help make a future slide in this presentation make a little more sense. So in many cases, and really we're sort of changing our thought to think about the whole supply chain. So at its simplest, it's producer, processor, and then some retail sort of node, and then the eventual consumer. So there is a system where, at least in the primary areas of the state of Montana, under the control of Montana Department of Livestock, there's a concept of a meat depot and a meat depot license. And this just allows an entity, usually a producer, to safely store cold meat with a license. And it can be just a bank of chest freezers in a clean, secure environment. But basically, they maintain some cold storage for themselves and for the meat that they're direct marketing. I can't speak to the exact rules regarding meat depots today on Native American reservations. We know that in those communities, USDA has the full authority, through their Food Safety Inspection Service, along with the local Indian Health Service or department, and the state Department of Livestock and their meat depot program does not exactly apply. But basically, to answer your question, yes, there is an opportunity for a producer to have their cattle processed into retail-ready products and then to store that appropriately cold until they market it through any of those channels I discussed. Direct to consumer, to a grocer, to a restaurant, to a school or other institution. Perhaps a more common scenario would be a producer works with the processor makes the retail ready and inspected products packaged, ready for that consumer. And then distribution goes straight from the processor to the restaurant, to the school, to the local grocer, etc. And we'll revisit this again with a flow chart, and it will begin to make a little more sense. So, okay, if you are a producer, first I want to recognize that seasonal calf sales may fit your needs, and it may be the business model that best suits your business, your family, and your lifestyle. And that is the conventional supply chain where calves are sold in the fall, or maybe some are retained, backgrounded, fed a little bit over the winter, and sold as a larger calf in the spring with a little more weight on them. But basically, the producer in that case is just on that primarily cow-calf end of the conventional supply chain. But when we begin to engage in local marketing, there's going to be more supply chain management responsibilities. The producer is going to be more engaged in a local supply chain, shorter supply chain geographically, and they may even manage multiple nodes themselves. So that local marketing is going to be more work, but it can have financial and personal rewards. So just want to make that clear. It's a hard work endeavor, but many people find it financially and personally rewarding. For example, there can be higher margins as we add value to that product within the state. In each step of fabrication, retail cuts, packaging, further processing to products like dinner sausages or snack sticks or jerky or luncheon meats. Every time we add value there, we're increasing value, and hopefully the producer is able to realize higher margins on their work, on their products, based on what these local products can sell for. If you're finishing on grass or feed, you're holding these animals longer, so you're just carrying the physical risk. A grass-fed finished animal, the producer may own for greater than 2 years to get them to market weight. If the producer is running their own feedlot, that shortens it up a bit, but we're still talking about animals that are, 12 months or more at least. So it's different than just managing risk and care of a calf from February, March till October. So that's just something to consider. And there are just environmental risks with animals on the landscape, even in the feedlot over that extra time. Weather, disease, predators, etc. Regardless of where you are across the United States, regardless of any type of, whether you're in a sovereign Indian nation or on other lands in America, retail products have to be inspected. So basically, there needs to be inspection at slaughter and some other degree of inspection or approval through further processing for that product to be packaged for retail sale. We'll cover that a little bit more in a moment. And I've already hit this last bullet point. There are new supply chain management responsibilities for a rancher or farmer that wants to direct market a meat product, or work with a processor, work with other producers for a locally branded meat product. You're just more engaged in that supply chain as opposed to selling calves once or twice a year, for example. What type of animals are we talking about? We're being pretty beef-centric here today, so we'll kind of stick with that. But we'll recognize there's hogs and poultry and lamb, even bison. There's other local meat opportunities. But one of the lowest hanging fruits for local use is selling your cull cows locally to a processor or working with a processor to have your cull cows processed. This is taking lower value cattle, adding value through processing into a meat product. These animals are ideal for, ground beef, burger type products, or those further processed products like the jerky and snack sticks and dinner sausages. And in some parts of the state, producers may be closer to a local processor than they are actually a cattle market, where normally they would unload those cull cows. Sort of the next step up would be finished cattle. And so in that case, we're looking at being able to market those premium cuts. Your steaks and some new specialty cuts, like the flat iron steak is getting a lot of attention lately. So adding value to a piece of the front shoulder that maybe had less value in the past. In addition to a burger and the further processed products. But with that finished cattle, you're really making it feasible to market those premium cuts. And then I will mention bison, although I am no expert here. Recognizing their culturally significant cuts and uses. Inspection leading to full-on retail sales for bison can be tricky. It can be done. It's done across the country, both on and off of native communities. The other thing with bison that I could do some more research on for you, but I'm not an expert, is there are exemptions relative to the inspection rules for tribal use and traditional uses of bison. So there are some opportunities there. But once again, that would be more family and community provisioning and not a retail opportunity. So part of this being an overview is, there's a lot to know, but we want to sort of break down, some of the fear or misunderstandings. So though there are rules, they may not be as confusing as they seem. So federal inspection, okay, this is where the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Food Safety Inspection Service supervises slaughter and potentially the further processing, all right? So in the case of USDA inspection, it allows sales to consumers across state lines. So that meat, that eventual meat that's been under the federal inspection can be sold locally, can be sold and used within your own community, but you have the opportunity to also sell it regionally across state lines or even nationally. In Montana, we also have a very active inspection division of the Montana Department of Livestock. So the state agency supervises slaughter and processing, but those products that are packaged for retail sale cannot cross state lines. So that's sales to consumers in the state only. And then once again, I just want to reiterate that consumers could include individuals and families, a wholesaler or distributor, the actual retailer, which could be a restaurant, a grocer, institutions, schools, community centers, rest homes, etc. Now, the most local level of inspection is usually done by a county or Indian Health Department. And so these would be the sanitarians, the folks that go out and inspect, restaurants and other local small food businesses. So this is for your butcher shops, your grocers, perhaps small further processors that aren't doing slaughter. They're just bringing in meat from somewhere else and making products. Value-added commercial kitchens. And there's a little scenario here outlined, and I also drew it out on my concluding slide. But I think for a lot of Native American communities, there will be potential to enter that retail space with this scenario. You'll probably have to work with a state or federally inspected processing plant that is off tribal property. But then you can bring the quarters, the halves, or boxed primals to a local facility, a local grocer, a local butcher shop. And that butcher, who's under the local sanitarian inspection, can make retail products, and they can be sold locally. They can go to the local schools and community centers. But except for on the Flathead Reservation, I am currently not aware, and I would like to know if I'm wrong, but I'm not aware of other reservations in Montana right now that have inspected processing plants. I know there have been some in the past, perhaps, but because of that reality, that's why I bring up this scenario here, where slaughter of your local cattle will probably have to take place outside your community under inspection, but then come back in and and then it can be further processed under that local inspection at a local butcher shop, inside a grocery store, etc. I get a lot of questions about mobile slaughter, and this is where you have an efficient and elaborate mobile facility. So a trailer that's built out for slaughter of livestock. A lot of these businesses have tried to get off the ground in Montana. They have not necessarily thrived. There's been a lot of turnover. There's still a lot of interest. It's coming back up. I will mention that the mobile slaughter situation can sometimes be ideal for bison. However, so the slaughter would happen on the ranch with the help of this mobile slaughter trailer, so in the field, so to speak. That slaughter day and process can be inspected. You can schedule an inspector to be there. However, the carcasses have to be moved somewhere else for cold storage, for aging, and then the further processing has to happen somewhere else. And then you would also have some, freshwater needs, wastewater management needs, and then, slaughter and butcher waste needs at that site where the mobile unit visits, for the actual slaughter process. So there's a lot to unpack there. It seems like it could be a good opportunity, but it's been difficult to make these businesses sustainable or viable in the long term. So I say it's about relationships. So what I mean is the local meat marketing is about personal and business relationships. It's about relationships throughout a supply chain. And I've sort of diagrammed some ideas of what that supply chain may look like. First and foremost, we have what we're calling the uninspected, or what's officially called custom exempt. And this is where a producer would work with a consumer, usually a family or families, and those consumers would actually invest in a share of that animal before it was slaughtered. Since the consumer is technically an owner or co-owner of that cattle, then it can be processed for their own use, not for retail sale, and it does not have to be part of an inspection scenario. Generally, plants that are doing custom exempt, they don't have the inspector on site for slaughter day and an inspector looking over other processes and a food safety plan called a HACCP plan in the meat industry. But they do have some oversight. Most of the plants doing custom exempt would have an annual visit by an inspector just to sort of make sure they're generally doing things correctly. But really, this is about private party relationships and the end consumer having an ownership stake in the animal before it's slaughtered. However, for retail options, you're going to be inspected in a variety of ways in different chains. There are multiple pathways here. I just mapped out a few examples. But the first one we see, there's a producer, and they work with a processor somewhere for slaughter only. Okay, so their animals are slaughtered and minimally processed to some steps, such as halves or quarters, or maybe some large primal cuts. But then they are moved to another supply chain node for further processing. So that could just be grinding it into bulk ground beef packages to go to a school. It could be making retail cuts or further processed products to go to a restaurant or grocer. And then, the consumer, whether a shopper or a diner at a restaurant, that's how they would get the product. The second example I mapped out here, we have a producer, they work with a processor that slaughters and does further processing, and then those products, different types, are moved to restaurants or grocers, and then eventually to the end consumer. And then finally, and Joel, thank you for bringing that question in about the meat depot. There are scenarios in particular where an individual producer might be marketing meat like under a brand name that is, related to their ranch or a co-op or partnership of producers. So the producer works with a processor to have the animals slaughtered under inspection, processed into retail cuts and further processed products, packaged, and then labeled with that rancher or that partnership's brand name. But then that rancher, that producer takes the retail product back, stores it at their meat depot, and then they run the marketing channel to move across the right of your screen. They may direct market, online sales, a farm stand, a CSA type of buyers club, or they may go market to the restaurant or grocer, and then through those nodes, eventually it gets to the end consumer. We could move these arrows all around and come up with a bunch of different scenarios, but I felt like these were some pretty common options. And I tried to make it as clear as possible on how that may work. And I feel like I've been talking way too much at the moment. I might just pause and see, what some other folks may want to add to this, or questions from our hosts and co-hosts, or from anybody online.
Well, I've got a question sort of was directly with this slide, but I've heard that a lot of beef processing facilities have a waiting list to get an animal processed. I mean, should a producer wait until they've got an animal and a buyer ready and then call? Or, should they try to schedule in advance that in September and January, I'm going to bring an animal in and then work to market the animal based on your processing time? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks, Joel. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention sort of what standard courtesy and best practices are as producers are more directly involved with the full supply chain. So when I say it's about relationships, that producer needs to build a relationship with a processor and those eventual markets you mentioned well ahead of time, right? So over the last decade or so, a lot of our local processors probably needed anywhere from 2 to 6 months of warning of like a potential slaughter date, and maybe a few months out, it's just a target of, I'm a local rancher, I'm going to have 10 finished steers that I want to bring to you in this month. But as it gets closer, you need to narrow that date down. With the most recent interest in local meat processing, processors are full. 6 months lead time is the minimum to try and get in with a processor. So once again, it's really important to do that scheduling ahead of time, build that business and personal relationship between the producer and the processor. Give the processor not just the date, but sort of an estimate of how you need that animal processed, the type of cuts you're looking at, perhaps, the type of packaging you need, etc. To sort of continue on that theme and answer the second part of your question, yeah, there's an adage that the freezer or cold storage is your worst customer. Whoever is running that facility is paying money, they're spending energy to keep that meat cold, and it's sitting there not making money, but they've already invested a lot of time and money just to get it into that freezer. So it's highly recommended that those relationships across the entire supply chain be developed ahead of time. So that means whether you and the processor are going to collectively market and get that product to the restaurant or grocer, you should have contracts and agreements in place to deliver across the whole supply chain a certain number of animals to the processor, and then a certain amount of product from the processor or meat depot to the retailer or directly to the customer. You really need to think forward and have agreements and contracts ahead of time throughout the whole supply chain, so that you're not stuck sitting on valuable product that you've already invested time and money in, that's not making money back for you.
Thanks. And maybe a follow-up to that too is, let's say I'm a producer and I decide I'm going to save 6 or 7 steers to finish and then market somehow locally. But now I get, 12 months down the road, their market weight, and I think I've only got a market for 3 or 4 of them, or I've only got processing for 3 or 4 of them. Any thoughts on recommendations on what I should do with the other 3 or 4 steers that I brought up to market weight that either I don't have a buyer for or don't have processing for?
Whew. That's a tough one. And, when the national meat plants shut down and we're going through the rolling shutdowns, we saw a lot of animals, particularly hogs, backing up, that had no place to go. They were market weight, they were requiring inputs and feed, they were getting bigger, bigger than the ideal size for processing. And so that caused a lot of problems. We're talking on a much smaller scale here, but really the solution is, preventive. And it goes back to your first question of studying your market a little bit and getting those agreements in place, so that you don't get stuck that way. Perhaps working with an attorney or legal aid to have aspects of contracts saying, that if some part of the supply chain, fails, that there's sort of a basement price that your contracted business partner that was going to take that animal or meat, has to pay to minimize losses. You may have to shift marketing channels, and just try and break even or minimize your losses. Maybe you can shift it to a cattle share, go the custom exempt route, or sometimes it's easier to get into a processor and, offer that cattle share and that eventual meat to directly to a consumer. But in general, there may not be many options, which is why, prevention and pre-planning for, the contracts, the processor, the retailer, or the end consumer, working through that supply chain to, make sure they have a place to go ahead of time.
And I'm assuming our weekly auctions are probably an outlet if we don't have another place to go, even though if the price on finished
Yeah,
animal is less
yeah.
control.
You just, you'll take the price you can get, and the price might not, if it was a finished animal that all of a sudden has nowhere to go, the price you get there at auction may help cover some losses, but it probably won't cover the time and effort and resources put into that animal. Yeah, so that, going to auction and taking what you get, it's just a risk. It could turn out fine, or it could just be minimizing your losses.
All right,
So,
thanks.
with that, I think that opportunities are really looking up across all communities in the United States for local meat processing. Um, I recommend that anybody at any part of the supply chain start small. Just consider a few head, and a simple marketing plan. But think ahead, have some agreements ahead of time of where that's going to go. Work together across that supply chain, build those relationships. Work together with other producers if you have an opportunity to perhaps, you know, have a group of producers and everybody, just finishes 2 to 4 head, but then you can take 20 and schedule 20 ahead to a processor and, market that together. That's a great way to go. And I just want to mention that there are some large regional and national Native American meat businesses that are doing great, but they took years to develop, and you track their success back, and it goes back to a neat idea, starting small, cooperation within the community, and then you end up with something like the Native American beef brand out of the American Southwest, um, with a consortium of Navajo producers and a national food distributor. That's one of the most famous examples. Um, Looking at further processing for bison out of South Dakota, you have the Tonka bars, a really delicious pemmican type product that's it's just going gangbusters right now with a lot of our um, paleo diet and with protein craze, and this summer everybody getting outside because you couldn't recreate or socialize inside because of COVID-19. These sort of outdoorsy snacks have been um, super successful, but this company's been around probably close to 20 years, and you know they started small within their own community with a good idea, and now they're a national, if not an international company, um, Native American owned and run. So there are, a lot of great opportunities, huge places you can go. But the first step is to start in your own community and build those relationships, strengthen and build those local supply chains, and, you know, be proud of feeding your own community and guests to your community in the region.
All right. Well, let me jump in here and just ask if there's any other questions from the audience. And while folks are maybe thinking of that, you're welcome to unmute or to type it in the chat window. I'll also remind folks that next week on September 18th at 10 o'clock, Eric Belasco will be talking about cattle markets and kind of an update on where cattle markets are. So mark your calendar for that. So let me pause here and see if there's any additional questions. All right. Well, not seeing any additional questions. It looks like you're off the hook there, Tommy. So first of all, thank you for taking the time and sharing your expertise. And again, if people would like to reach out to Tommy, if you don't have his contact information, get a hold of me or Carrie Schumacher, and we'd be happy to get you in touch with Tommy. And I know Tommy's got considerably more material available and knowledge than we were able to cover here today. So if you do have questions, please reach out to Tommy. With that, I'll just say thanks everyone for joining us, and I hope you'll join us again next week.
Thanks, everybody.